The ritual was never meant to free you, it was meant to keep you rehearsing who you are not, year after year. When you stop obeying the calendar, the fracture closes and the voice that was always rushing finally loses authority. This is the forbidden shift. Change does not begin in time, it begins in alignment. Feel where your breath already knows this. Stay with this realization, because what follows next depends on whether you listen. January 1st arrives without a change in the sky, without a shift in the ground, without the body recognizing a new breath. The mind still wakes mid-sentence, already narrating pressure while the chest tightens as if something invisible must be done. A beginning declared without nature fractures attention from reality, teaching the psyche to obey labels instead of rhythms. You feel the split as a quiet static between what is announced and what is actually happening inside. If nothing truly begins, why does the inner voice insist that something must? You sit up in bed while a pale screen glows, the calendar flipping as if a switch were thrown somewhere beyond your control. There is tension in noticing that the same thought repeats, unchanged, while the date pretends to move forward. When time is declared rather than felt, awareness is pushed into abstraction instead of presence. The breath steadies for a moment, and the body recognizes there has been no real crossing. This false start trains the nervous system to accept movement without arrival. Nature resets through cycles you can feel in muscle and light, not through numbers printed on paper. The discomfort comes from sensing that your own rhythm has been overruled by an external stamp. When a system ignores biological timing, it creates a fracture where motivation and energy fail to meet. You recognize this each year as resolve rises briefly and then dissolves back into familiar weight. What kind of change can survive when it begins disconnected from breath? Outside, the day looks identical, the street sounds the same, and your posture does not magically straighten with the date. A quiet irritation appears when effort is demanded without an internal signal to move. Real beginnings emerge from alignment, not announcements, from coherence between mind and body. This understanding settles like a slow exhale, removing blame without offering escape. The pattern does not accuse you, it simply reveals a mismatch. The inner voice keeps speaking as if commanded by the calendar, rehearsing promises you did not consciously choose. There is tension in realizing the next thought arrives before consent, pulling attention into expectation rather than awareness. When beginnings are imposed, agency weakens, and identity learns to follow rather than initiate. You feel this as a subtle hollowing, a sense of standing near a doorway that never fully opens. If the fracture happens at the start, where does real change actually begin? The calendar once turned with the soil, with light returning to fields and bodies preparing to move. Something tightens when you realize that this natural pulse was interrupted, replaced by an administrative decision made far from lived rhythm. Time was rearranged not to reflect life, but to organize people. This thought settles quietly, like dust falling after a structure is shifted. What changes inside you when the clock was never designed to serve your nervous system? March once marked renewal because movement, war, labor, and survival required it. There is a subtle unease in noticing that January was placed first to serve authority, not alignment. When time is centralized, behavior becomes predictable and manageable. You feel the echo of this predictability in how your own year is expected to unfold. Is it coincidence that obedience begins with the calendar? Taxes, armies, records, and control demanded synchronization, not harmony. The discomfort arises when you see how deeply this structure still governs your internal pace. A shared clock replaced local rhythms, training minds to move together regardless of readiness. This realization lands calmly, without anger, simply as clarity. How much of your urgency belongs to you, and how much was inherited? As empires expanded, their calendars replaced seasonal knowing with numbered obligation. There is tension in sensing that what feels universal was once imposed. When timekeeping spreads through force and belief, it begins to feel inevitable rather than chosen. The body still remembers another language of timing, even if the mind forgot it. What does your body know that the calendar never learned? You glance at the month names and notice the quiet misalignment hidden in plain sight. The insight arrives softly. Systems that reorder time also reorder identity. When everyone shares the same artificial beginning, individuality dissolves into coordination. This understanding steadies the mind, removing confusion without demanding rebellion. If time itself was adjusted for control, where does personal authority actually live? January carries a name that quietly shapes the way attention splits before you notice it happening. There is tension in sensing the mind pulled backward by memory while being dragged forward by expectation at the same time. Janus encodes a philosophy where identity is stretched between regret and anticipation, leaving no ground beneath the feet. You feel this division as a faint pressure behind the eyes, like standing between two mirrors. How can presence survive when attention is trained to look everywhere except here? Thoughts drift toward what should have been done differently, then snap toward what must finally be fixed. The emotional strain builds as the present moment becomes merely a hallway between failures and fantasies. A mind trained this way never settles, because it is always correcting or preparing. The breath shortens slightly, reflecting the body's confusion about where to land. If the present is ignored, where does agency actually operate? The symbolism is subtle but relentless, teaching that value exists only in comparison. There is discomfort in realizing how naturally this comparison has become internalized. When time is framed as past versus future, self-worth becomes conditional and unstable. This insight arrives quietly, like noticing a crack that has always been there. Who are you when neither face is allowed to speak? At the midpoint of reflection, something sharper appears beneath the ritual. The mind realizes it has been rehearsing absence, never fully inhabiting its own moment. When attention is split, identity fragments, and motivation leaks through the gaps. This recognition steadies awareness without offering comfort. What power can emerge from a self that is never fully present? January repeats this division annually, reinforcing a habit rather than marking renewal. There is tension in noticing how familiar this split feels, as if it has always been yours. Over time, the present becomes thinner, less trusted, less inhabited. The body waits, the mind plans, and life quietly passes between them. If this division was learned, can it also be unlearned? Midnight arrives wrapped in darkness, not in the slow opening of light that the body recognizes as a beginning. There is tension in feeling excitement mixed with unease as the countdown compresses emotion into a narrow moment. The psyche becomes most malleable when orientation is lost and anticipation peaks. You feel this as a tightening behind the ribs, a pause where thought waits for instruction. Why is the moment chosen when awareness is least anchored? The clock ticks louder as voices rise, glasses lift, and the room holds its breath together. Emotional intensity surges, and the mind opens like an unlocked door under pressure. Suggestibility increases when certainty dissolves, especially in liminal spaces between days. This explains why promises feel powerful for a moment and hollow soon after. What enters the mind when it is opened by darkness instead of clarity? Midnight has always carried ritual weight because it disorients the senses. There is discomfort in realizing how often disorientation is mistaken for transformation. When the body is tired and the mind overstimulated, authority shifts outward. This insight settles quietly, removing mystery without removing meaning. A beginning chosen at weakness does not test truth, it tests compliance. Notice now, without changing anything, the moment just before an impulse speaks. There is a small gap where the breath hesitates and the shoulders subtly brace. This pause is where influence either enters or dissolves. Let the breath drop once, slower than the thought, and feel the body reclaim timing. The practice is not effort, it is recognition. Morning does not arrive with fireworks, yet it aligns with biology every time. The calm realization is that clarity prefers light, rest, and orientation. When change is decided from coherence rather than intensity, it integrates instead of evaporating. This understanding grounds the nervous system instead of exciting it. If beginnings shape outcomes, why choose them at your weakest hour? A resolution sounds simple, yet the body reacts as if a verdict has been delivered. There is tension in declaring that something about you must be fixed later, not understood now. This frames growth as a correction of failure rather than an unfolding of capacity. You feel the weight of this framing as a subtle tightening in posture, like standing before an internal judge. What happens to motivation when improvement begins with self-condemnation? The language of resolution carries an invisible blade, dividing who you are from who you should become. Emotional pressure builds because the present self is treated as insufficient by design. When identity is split this way, effort is fueled by avoidance instead of curiosity. The mind nods in agreement while the body quietly resists. Can a divided self generate coherent change? A promise made to the future creates a debt the present must somehow repay. There is discomfort in realizing how quickly this debt turns into quiet shame. Shame does not motivate growth, it enforces repetition. This insight lands steadily, stripping drama from the cycle. Why would a system that relies on guilt ever produce freedom? Each broken resolution becomes evidence collected against your own word. The emotional echo accumulates, teaching the nervous system to expect collapse. When self-promises fail repeatedly, trust erodes at the most intimate level. You recognize this erosion in the hesitation that appears before committing to anything deeply personal. How do you rebuild authority when the judge and the accused are the same voice? If this is hitting close to home, take a second, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me. The calendar resets, but the internal contract remains unsigned and unresolved. There is tension in sensing that the ritual never aimed to support you, only to bind you. Growth that begins with judgment loops back into judgment, year after year. This realization settles like a mirror finally turned toward its frame. If change is framed as correction, who decided you were broken to begin with? Failure appears quickly, not as surprise, but as a quiet inevitability built into the frame. There is tension in pushing forward with intensity while the body already anticipates collapse. When change is demanded without identity alignment, effort burns fast and leaves residue. You feel this as a brief surge followed by heaviness, like breath held too long. Is it weakness, or was the structure never meant to hold? The deadline arrives with pressure rather than clarity, tightening thought instead of focusing it. Emotional strain increases because willpower is treated as infinite while stress quietly drains it. A system that depends on force ignores how judgment narrows perception and reduces choice. This recognition settles the mind, removing self-blame without offering excuse. Failure here is not personal, it is mechanical. Abrupt change fractures continuity, asking the nervous system to leap instead of adapt. There is discomfort in noticing how quickly enthusiasm converts into avoidance. When identity is not involved, behavior has nothing stable to return to. The body remembers this pattern before the mind admits it. How long can pressure substitute for coherence? Each restart feels official, yet nothing underneath has reorganized. The calm insight is that repetition is not persistence when the starting point never shifts. Systems that reset without integration guarantee relapse. This lands quietly, like realizing the same doorway keeps leading to the same room. Understanding stabilizes where effort once thrashed. The cycle depends on collapse to justify recommitment, keeping motion without transformation. There is tension in sensing how familiar this loop feels, almost comforting in its predictability. When failure is expected, it becomes permission to stop listening inward. You notice the breath shallow at the first sign of strain, already preparing to exit. If failure is engineered, what would happen if you stopped consenting to the structure that needs it? Each broken promise leaves a faint residue that the mind does not forget. There is tension in realizing that the disappointment is quieter now, almost expected, as if trust has thinned over time. The subconscious learns from repetition, not intention, and it records reliability more than desire. You feel this learning in the hesitation that appears before making even small commitments. What does it mean when your own word no longer feels solid? Confidence erodes not through failure itself, but through inconsistency with self. Emotional weight builds because the inner voice starts to doubt before action begins. When self-trust weakens, authority migrates outward to systems, plans, and external enforcement. This shift settles subtly, like posture collapsing without notice. Who leads when internal authority steps aside? At the midpoint of recognition, something ruptures gently but unmistakably. You notice how often you wait for permission, structure, or accountability to move. Dependency feels safer when self-trust is fractured, because it removes the risk of self-betrayal. This realization steadies awareness rather than shaming it. If trust was outsourced, can it be reclaimed? Look closely at the next impulse to promise something big. There is a brief tightening in the chest and a rehearsed optimism that feels familiar. Instead of pledging, pause and let one small action complete itself fully today. Completion repairs trust more than ambition ever could. Let this be noticed, not announced. Over years, repeated disappointment teaches the psyche to lower expectation of itself. There is tension in sensing how deeply this lesson has embedded, shaping identity quietly. Self-trust returns only through congruence between thought, word, and action. This truth lands without urgency, offering stability instead of pressure. If trust is rebuilt through alignment, what would that change about how you choose your next step? The idea of a fresh start is introduced before you understand what it costs. There is tension in remembering how early the calendar taught you that today is never enough on its own. Childhood rituals wrap the new year in sparkle, noise, and promise, while quietly displacing satisfaction into the future. You feel the echo of this conditioning as a faint impatience with the present moment. When did waiting become more natural than inhabiting? Midnight becomes magical before dawn ever has a chance to matter. Emotional attachment forms around dates rather than readiness, teaching the nervous system to look outward for permission. When change is tied to a number, the present self is subtly framed as incomplete. This belief settles softly, like a shadow that grows without being noticed. How much of your restlessness was learned before you could question it? The clean slate is never truly clean, yet it is celebrated as salvation. There is discomfort in realizing how often worth is postponed into a future version of yourself. When identity is always becoming, it never arrives. This insight lands calmly, removing urgency without removing meaning. Who are you allowed to be if improvement is no longer deferred? Notice right now the impulse to wait for a better moment. There is a small bodily signal, a pause in breath, a slight lean forward as if life is about to begin elsewhere. Let the breath drop once into the chest and feel the weight of the body where it already is. This is not a technique, it is recognition of timing returning inward. Stay until the impulse softens on its own. The ritual taught you to distrust the present in favor of a promised future. There is tension in seeing how consistently that future dissolves when it arrives. Change that waits for permission never develops roots. This understanding stabilizes attention instead of exciting it. If readiness is internal, what moment have you been postponing yourself away from? Around the world, the same countdown reaches zero in waves of light and noise. There is tension in sensing how regret, hope, and self-judgment synchronize across billions of minds at once. A collective ritual amplifies emotion until lack feels universal and personal simultaneously. You feel this amplification as a subtle pressure to compare, to measure, to fall in line. What happens when dissatisfaction becomes a shared signal instead of a private reflection? Screens glow with identical messages, promises, and declarations repeating across time zones. Emotional weight increases as individual uncertainty dissolves into a global chorus of becoming better later. When lack is broadcast at scale, it normalizes incompletion as identity. This realization settles quietly, stripping comfort from the crowd without isolating you from it. Is belonging worth the cost of rehearsing inadequacy together? The ritual does not need to be spoken to be absorbed. There is discomfort in noticing how easily the body absorbs the mood before the mind questions it. Collective emotion trains personal expectation, especially when repeated without interruption. This insight lands calmly, like hearing a familiar song finally end. If the signal repeats yearly, how deeply has it shaped your self-image? At some point, awareness steps back from the crowd. You notice the breath slow while the noise continues without you. This moment restores orientation, not through resistance, but through separation. If this recognition resonates, mark it quietly by acknowledging it where you are now. Let that acknowledgement be enough. Global synchronization magnifies what already exists within, but it does not create it. There is tension in realizing how rarely this ritual invites wholeness, only improvement. When the dominant message is not enough yet, desire never rests. This understanding steadies the mind rather than exciting it. If you step out of the broadcast, what voice finally becomes audible? Time is presented as a straight line running out, rather than a rhythm unfolding. There is tension in feeling chased by numbers that never pause, even when the body needs stillness. Linear time turns life into a countdown instead of a cycle. You feel this as a constant low urgency, like a clock ticking behind the ribs. Who benefits when time is experienced as an enemy? Aging becomes something to outrun rather than a process to inhabit. Emotional pressure builds as moments are framed as lost or wasted the instant they pass. When time is scarce, compliance feels necessary and hesitation feels dangerous. This belief settles quietly, shaping decisions before they are questioned. What choices are made differently under the fear of running out? New Year rituals sharpen this fear by marking another unit gone forever. There is discomfort in noticing how easily urgency replaces discernment. When people feel behind, they accept pressure, speed, and external direction more readily. This insight lands without accusation, simply as pattern recognition. How much obedience is generated by the fear of falling behind time? The body does not experience time as linear, yet it is forced to live inside that story. There is tension in sensing how often internal rhythm is overridden by schedules and deadlines. When the clock becomes master, intuition becomes unreliable by comparison. This realization steadies awareness, offering clarity without rebellion. What wisdom disappears when internal timing is ignored? The ritual teaches you to race the clock instead of listen to yourself. There is a quiet heaviness in recognizing how deeply this lesson has shaped motivation. Control of time perception becomes control of behavior. This understanding lands slowly, like stepping out of a current that was always pulling. If time stopped commanding you, what would finally move on its own? You do not need a new year to begin, you need to return to the point where choice is still yours. Let the next decision come from alignment instead of urgency, and notice how the body responds when it is no longer being chased. Stay with this awareness as you move through your day, and allow one small action to complete fully without promise or announcement. What would change if you trusted rhythm over pressure? This is not an ending, but a reorientation toward something quieter and more precise. Carry this recognition forward, revisit it when the clock demands obedience, and let it guide the next choice you make today. If this shift feels familiar, follow the thread and remain here as the pattern continues to unfold. Are you ready to see how alignment reshapes everything that follows?